Académie d'été, pharmacon, Académie d'été. Attention,
Organologie.
Neganthropologie.
To be clear, what is at stake with the Neganthropocene is the problem of revolution, of the unavoidable necessity of imagining some kind of turn and transformation, but a revolution of another kind which must be realized in another way, however improbably. No doubt this sounds obscure. We can certainly understand, as Husserl pointed out, that it is possible that entropy will put an end to all life on Earth. And there is undoubtedly a will to conceive this possibility, just as our unconscious imagination must at some level want the nightmares that present to our sleeping selves the negative prospects that it is necessary to conjure so as to find within them a means of avoidance, a way out, a buried wish functioning as a spur to act. A significant portion of the culture industry is dedicated to the generation of such apocalyptic nightmares, but of course the motive is less prophylaxis than profit. Yet the difficulty remains of really imagining that such nightmares must concern us right away, when they are occurring at the microscopic level of gas molecule accumulations and the beyond macroscopic level of planetary systems. What is at stake with the Neganthropocene, then, is, as Bernard has said, the possibility of a conversion of the gaze, through which a shift can be effected from the plane of the ordinary to that of the extraordinary, or the extraordinary, where it becomes possible, like a seer, to see what is invisible. What makes the Neganthropocenic revolution so difficult to envisage is the unprecedented character of its spatial and temporal coordinates. On the one hand, it is absolutely urgent, while on the other hand, it must be perpetual and long-lasting. On the one hand, it involves and must involve a technical system that is planetary in its extent, while on the other hand, it involves and must involve the vast plurality of local, subplanetary, social and cultural systems whose destruction is a major entropic aspect. Any new neganthropic leap must address these dimensions, which are telescopic both temporally and spatially. As Kant says in The Conflict of the Faculties, it must have regard to the whole scope of all the peoples on earth, where what such a regard reveals is the prospect of an immeasurable time. Such is the planetary scope and immeasurable time of the Neganthropocene. It is then a question of the conditions of possibility of such a conversion of the gaze, through which entropes could be converted to negantropes capable of releasing a revolutionary will of immeasurable spatio-temporal extent. The question of these conditions is raised, obscurely perhaps, in Husserl's reflections on the Earth arc. If the world exists in the ideality of infinity, beyond what is experienced of the world from this or that side, I'm quoting from Husserl here, and if, in the primordial shape of its representation, that is initially, in the beginning, the Earth itself does not move, nevertheless, he argues, after Copernicus and the telescope, it does move in a sense that we would argue eventually involves not just its cosmic displacement, but its anthropocenic mutation. But this alteration in the shape of the Earth's representation, according to Husserl, does not follow automatically from the telescopic gaze, but only from a second moment, from the extraterrestrial conversion that the gaze permitted by such an invention makes possible. Only when we think of our stars as secondary arcs with their eventual humanities, etc., only when we figure ourselves as transplanted there among these humanities, perhaps flying there, is it otherwise. This question of the conversion of the gaze is what Peter Zendy, too, addresses in Kant in the Land of the Extraterrestrials, Cosmopolitical Philosophics. He notices, for example, that this is how the French Revolution functions for Kant in the conflict of the faculties. As an act of publicity, capable of fostering a wishful participation that borders closely on enthusiasm. Or, in other words, an aesthetic point of view through which a revolution's movement of worldwide expansion can be envisaged or seen in advance. Kant argues that, for those who did not actually participate in the French Revolution, he himself, for example, apprehending the revolution via the aesthetic conditions of publicity may open up an even broader participation, one capable of extending the localized possibility of perpetual progress exposed by the French Revolution to the macro locality consisting of all the peoples of the earth. That for Kant, this worldwide extension of progress implies a cosmopolitanism resides in mankind's unsocial sociability, in the fact that, as he says in Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, people cannot do without being together peacefully and yet cannot avoid constantly being objectionable to one another. Living together requires a cosmopolitanism that is constantly threatened by disunion, but generally progresses toward a coalition, he says. What necessitates a cosmopolitics is thus the perpetual problem of managing the tendencies and counter-tendencies involved in the relationships of care between the microcosms that we are and the macrocosms that we produce. Zendy shows how the extension of this perpetual problem to all the peoples of the earth seems to imply the need for a cosmic gaze capable of encompassing this proliferation of standpoints within its purview. And, indeed, he goes on to find in numerous key points in Kant's work an explicit evocation of this extraterrestrial gaze, precisely in order to insist on the necessity and impossibility of picturing to oneself the character of the rational terrestrial beings that we hope to be. We require a wholly other gaze. We must imagine the telescopic gaze of the extraterrestrial, intimately haunted by this infinitely far-away regard, if we earthlings hope to achieve a conversion through which to escape the local limits of our microcosmic preoccupations. And since we've been talking in the Academy about Peter Thiel's 2004 lecture on the Straussian moment, it is worth noting that he summarises Carl Schmitt's anti-universalism by saying, absent, this is Thiel, absent an invasion by aliens from outer space, there never can be a world state that politically unites all of humanity. It is a logical impossibility. But back to Kant. Kant says, for example, that human beings are incomparable because we lack any experience of any non-human rational beings to whom we might compare ourselves. Kant. We have no knowledge of the non-terrestrial beings that would enable us to indicate their characteristic property and so to characterize this terrestrial being that we are among rational beings in general. Zendy shows why this impossible necessity therefore means that the question of cosmopolitan revolution requires the aesthetic judgment of the beautiful as a standpoint that can arise only from a process that is at once purely individual and yet inherently social. In short, it requires a process of psychic and collective individuation aiming, through a process of universalization, at consistencies. But it also requires the sublime because, as what exceeds the limits of the capacities of our imagination, the sublime is what causes every standpoint to tremble. Only through this unsettling of every perspective, effected by the experience of the unimaginable, would it become possible to operate a pure reason, speculating in the direction of an immeasurable cosmology capable of authorizing an infinite cosmopolitanism. What Zendi tries to do then is to sketch out a pathway, as he says, from the aesthetic to the political by way of a speculative cosmology, finding that it is as if the each and every one of us, on the basis of which the judgment of taste is oriented, could include humanity as such only when taking a cosmo-theoretical detour through the wholly other that inhabits extraterrestrial globes. And insofar as this detour through the extraterrestrial is necessary in order to imagine a cosmic cosmopolitanism capable of staving off the threat of disunion, of embracing the whole earth, and of doing so even beyond imagination and in the very failure of the imagination, Zendi refers to the imperative of cosmopolitical philosophiction. More than anything, it is this irreducible fictive element in politics that means that such a politics is essentially aesthetic, cosmetic. And it is why he concludes that today any revolution must be enacted on a terrain which he says where a war is being waged whose stakes are a veritable geopolitics of the sensible. The terrain on which this cosmo-geopolitics of the sensible is being conducted is the mnemotechnical milieu that amounts today to the sphere of what Heidegger called Gestell. But it is also each of the individual microcosms that we ourselves hope to be, and that are the psychic apparatuses of the processes of psychic individuation that each of us are in our inextricable entanglement with the complex exorganisms that we produce. But these exorganisms also produce us, and the possibility that our globalized technical systems might anticipate and post-produce our very psychic microcosm to such an extent as to automate the will itself is what threatens to make this geopolitical war of the sensible unwinnable. Our descent into this vortex created by the automation of the will and elimination of motive has now crossed a threshold after which we can indeed speak of an age of post-truth, where the latter is nothing but the nihilistic symptom of a loss of the will to care for the difference that knowledge or truth makes to the future. The possibility of such an age, however, derives ultimately from the fictive element involved in the way our psychic microcosms apprehend the world, from the fact that every cosmopolitics involves a cosmetics, as Zendi says, a touch-up of the sensible. It is this fictive cosmetic element that makes post-truth possible, because it is both the condition that makes truth possible in the first place and what makes possible the conditioning of the apprehension of the world. For Zendi, all this is what dawns on the viewer of the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers. What one beholds in that classic science fiction film from 1956 is a biopower of mechanical reproducibility, a hypersynchronized process of metamorphosis without change, a biotechnological anthill effected through a dual movement that snatches bodies and creates a sort of copy. But what this strange form of mimetic contagion really concerns is the snatching of minds. It eliminates difference and establishes the reign of the they, of a transformed and reticulated race of those about whom we could reverse Wittgenstein's formulation. We believe that they are automatons, but do we also believe that they are without suffering? For Zendi, for whom film is above all an affair of point of view, and telescopic in the sense of being stretched towards a distance beyond points of view, however close it may be, the virtue of invasion of the body snatchers lies in having revealed the invaders who do not just come from inside, but inhabit and so condition our own point of view. The film allows our indifference to be seen via the indifferent gaze of the clone, as if the director were desperately trying to grasp the ungraspable difference between difference and indifference, the indistinct distinction that cannot be seen, but that instead looks out at us, concerns us. Okay. I doubt there's anyone in this room who isn't familiar with the way that Bernard uses Husserl's account of the melodic temporal object to describe this fictive element in our apprehension of the world. The fact that secondary retention forms the selection criteria for the anticipation and post-production involved in primary retention and protension, which implies that immediate perception involves an irreducible element of imagination. Or the way he extends this analysis in order to demonstrate that tertiary retention introduces an element of controllability into the composition of primary and secondary retention and protension, opening up through the exactitude of mnemotechnics the processes of adoption and interpretation that lie at the root of politics, law, and rational knowledge as the material transcendence, so to speak, of the mere aspects provided by individual viewpoints, but where the very same potentials for control also make possible the dissolution of such processes. The analysis of the temporal object, in other words, shows how tertiary retention is what, pharmacologically, opens up the prospect of an immeasurable time precisely through the measurability it makes possible, and what always contains the threat of closing off that possibility through the conditioning and control of apprehension in a way that reduces it to calculability. What makes the melody such an exemplary case is not just that it is a temporal object in the sense that, like consciousness, it exists only in the time of its flowing through consciousness. This exemplarity further lies in the way that the experience of the oral temporal object also, in a sense, negates the question of standpoint. In principle, it does not matter where one is or where one is standing or how one is physically oriented in relation to the data being received through the oral physiological apparatus. The example of the melody works, and in fact works best, if one imagines oneself listening with closed eyes. Paradoxically, bracketing off the question of viewpoint is the very way of seeing that what determines the singularity of bearing oral witness is different horizons of expectation, rather than varying spatial coordinates, and that these different expectations derive from having had a singular past. This assumption that we can bracket the question of viewpoint is, I believe, reasonable. And in terms of the question of the conversion of the gaze, it may indeed be that the question of the conversion is more important than the question of the gaze. Nevertheless, given that the subject of these conversions are all those psychic individuals who are always localized microcosms, there may be more to say about what difference it makes to this account if we choose not to take oral perception as paradigmatic. For Kant, as we have seen, the threat of disunion contained in unsocial sociability is itself the condition of possibility and necessity of cosmopolitanism. In the age of post-truth, however, the fictioning that surrounds every political narrative means that this threat of disunion functions more as a condition of impossibility. Two utterly divergent audiences perceive the very same mediatized political narratives, but do so from what seem diametrically and rigidly opposed viewpoints, where this side and that side prove absolutely irreconcilable, a state of affairs that has been referred to by one commentator as the advent of a two-movie reality, where two movies play on one screen, that this is the political reality of the United States today. In light of this new two-movie reality, which should be understood as a reduction to only two movies, a state of the union where the same givens lead to indissolubly hardened perceptual oppositions, and so to the materialization of the threat of absolute disunion, that is, uncivil war. In the rest of this paper, I'd like to make a case for thinking about specifically visual temporal objects by referring not to Husserl, but to Wittgenstein, and specifically to his notion of aspects. In other words, if it's a question of the conditions of possibility of a new perspectivism, the question to be addressed in the rest of this paper is whether a perspective is the same thing as a point of view. But before that, and as a reward for listening to so much English, let's pause for a visual interlude. Okay, here we have a perspective of a duck. Yes. After the invention of perspective. Here we have a perspective on a rabbit. Here we have maybe a duck. It's been thought to be a duck, but it's from the Upper Paleolithic. Now we have another image from the Upper Paleolithic, which has been thought to be a hare or a rabbit. Or maybe a rabbit is a more recent invention, so a hare. Here we have a duck from the culture industry, but when the culture industry was still hand-drawn. Here we have a rabbit, also from the culture industry. Here we have a bottle opener for opening bottles. So we have a technical fact, in this case courtesy of Gucci, circa 1970. And here we have another bottle opener, this time a duck, and so we can see that it is really a technical tendency. Here we have the Gucci again, and this is where we're going, which is similar to this, which is, as you probably know, a duck rabbit. And I think we can even begin to see the duck in the bottle opener. And here we have another duck rabbit, a rabbit, a duck, and so. The duck rabbit, which Wittgenstein calls a picture object, is not, strictly speaking, a temporal object. It does not exist as a flow in time in the same way as a melody. Nevertheless, there is something essentially temporal about the way this bistable percept is apprehended, in the sense that the mutual exclusivity of the duck and the rabbit is necessarily experienced across the span of more than one moment. We can't see the duck and the rabbit in the same instant. Hence, Wittgenstein distinguishes the continuous seeing of an aspect from the dawning of an aspect. To notice an aspect is to notice the dawning of a change. But the issue, of course, is to understand the character of this change, to know what it is that changes, what kind of movement this involves, and where this change is located. What the bistable percept picture object makes plain is the possibility that, as Wittgenstein puts it, the dawning of a second aspect, the duck or the rabbit, may be the expression of a new perception, and at the same time of the perceptions being unchanged. But if it is not the external stimulus that has changed, since, as in the case of the gramophone recording, the perceptual data remains identical across the time of a change in perception, nevertheless, Wittgenstein insists that this does not mean that perception is merely something subjective. And above all, do not say, after all, my visual impression isn't the drawing, it is this, which I can't show anyone. Of course it is not the drawing, but neither is it anything of the same category which I carry within myself. The concept of the inner picture is misleading, for this concept uses the outer picture as a model. There is no inner picture that we might hope to divorce from the tertiary retention. The picture object exists, or rather consists, in some place that we can locate neither internally nor externally. As Bernard insists, the image in general does not exist. Wittgenstein thus describes the dawning of an aspect, somewhat imprecisely perhaps, as half visual experience, half thought. To the extent that it is something produced in me, he says it must be a sort of copy, something that in its turn can be looked at, almost something like a materialization. And because we produce this copy of a tertiary retention, and because we can look at it, that is, reiterate it, are we not, he wonders, already involved in an interpretation of the picture object? But Wittgenstein then asks, how is it possible to see an object according to an interpretation? What more is involved in the ability to carry out such an interpretation? For Wittgenstein does indeed think that there is something more involved. If the dawning of the duck or the rabbit can happen in a flash, the immediacy of the occurrence of this aspect should not mislead us. As he then notes, there are styles of painting that immediately convey meaning to some people, but not to others, say not to him. And so he concludes, I think custom and upbringing have a hand in this. The dawning of the duck or the rabbit depends on a prior knowledge of the form of these animals, but more generally on a process and practice of familiarization with a way of gazing. It is, in other words, overdetermined by the circuits of transindividuation through which we learn the capability that alone allows aspects to dawn. What Wittgenstein is describing here in his description of what is seen, as he calls it, is phenomenological intentionality. However far, in other respects, Wittgenstein's philosophy may be from Husserl's. Wittgenstein describes the intentionality involved in the dawning of aspects as seeing as. We can see this picture object as a duck or as a rabbit. We can see it like this or like that. The relationship of such an account to the melodic temporal object is made even clearer when Wittgenstein himself raises the example of a musical theme, which on different occasions, as he says, we can hear as a march or as a dance. His account of the intentionality involved in seeing a duck or a rabbit, or in hearing a melody as a march or a dance, is an ability that would only be said of someone capable of making certain applications. The substratum of this experience is a mastery of a technique. From this it follows that the aspect that dawns, the duck or the rabbit, is not just something that is in the picture object. It is not a property of the object, but an internal relation between it and other objects, or, as Zendi puts it, the fold of an internal difference that only becomes visible at the limit, which we must learn to apprehend. And Wittgenstein goes so far as to say, and I can see it in various aspects according to the fiction I surround it with. Here, however, there is a paradox. Wittgenstein had said, as we saw, that we see according to an interpretation. But surrounding the object as we do with fictive elements, through which we seem to immediately see the object as this or that, Wittgenstein hesitates and wonders if this is really to interpret what we see differently, or whether it is not, on the contrary, to really see something different each time. He's inclined to conclude the latter. The dawning of an aspect really is seeing something different. It is, therefore, he thinks, not quite a matter of seeing it according to a different interpretation. He's reluctant to call this an interpretation, in other words, because the internal difference that becomes visible here does not, in fact, reach the limit of actual noesis. It is merely having an image, whereas to interpret is already to think. To see an aspect, Wittgenstein thinks, only involves the power of the imagination, even if, as he also thinks, it is indeed subject to the will. We can decide to see the duck or the rabbit. And finally, even if this dawning does indeed involve an image whose aspect we can change at will, so to speak, it is also, in its initial occurrence, a change that, a dawning that, as Wittgenstein says, produces a surprise. But for Wittgenstein, this surprehension is not of a kind capable of causing the trembling of every comprehension, even if this is precisely how the duck-rabbit drawing functions for his own comprehension. Wittgenstein's account of noticing aspects is undoubtedly pertinent to the Stiglerian appropriation of the Husserlian analysis of the temporal object. By taking the duck-rabbit as a paradigmatic picture object, just as Husserl took the melody as a paradigmatic temporal object, Wittgenstein succeeds in finding a case of identical repetition, as occurs in repeated listening to sound recordings. Wittgenstein's example is a case of the post-production of primary attention applied to visual perception, but one that is independent of the question of viewpoint, while nevertheless being dependent on the localized conditions of learned capabilities. But of what use is his account of aspects for any theory or practice involved in the question of the prospects of the immeasurable time of the Neganthropocene? To answer this question, we need to pursue Wittgenstein's account just a little further. Having noted that seeing an aspect is more like an act of imaginative will than interpretative will, even if it remains dependent on the learned capability of seeing something as something, Wittgenstein wonders if there could be human beings lacking in the capacity to see something as something, a problem he refers to as aspect blindness. One might think that, with this concept of aspect blindness, Wittgenstein is referring to the kind of visual agnosia that can occur as a result of brain injury. But on the basis of his account of aspectival perception as inherently involving learned, if unconscious, intentionality, what is at stake here is, in fact, the loss of the trans-individuated knowledge that enables someone to see something as something, or, in other words, the possibility of a kind of perceptual proletarianization. Furthermore, Wittgenstein's concern with aspect blindness is not, in fact, limited to sense perception. He immediately extends the scope of the question of aspects, and hence of aspect blindness, when he makes a direct connection between seeing an aspect and experiencing the meaning of a word. And this, in turn, and it's a complicated discussion in Wittgenstein that we have to skip. And this, in turn, is then framed in terms of a difference, even a difference, between the knowledge involved in the capacity to read and the information contained in the words written on the page. When I read a poem or narrative with feeling, surely something goes on in me which does not go on when I merely skim the lines for information. What processes am I alluding to? The sentences have a different ring, a different sound. Wittgenstein thus extends his account from a kind of visual blindness to a kind of linguistic blindness, itself capable of being generalized to logos as the symbolic, the logical, the sensational, and the exclamatory character of noetic difference in general. Wittgenstein himself, in the passage where he describes the fiction with which the viewer surrounds the picture object, points out that these perceptual questions are not simply questions for physiology, for here, he says, the physiological is a symbol for the logical, which we would understand in an expanded sense of the logical. The virtue of this concept of an aspect that is akin to the concept of an image, then, lies in the way it telescopes its way beyond the visual and the linguistic to a kind of noetic generality. The dawning of another aspect is the capacity for surprise, for a perceptual act that sees the image with a wholly other gaze that makes every standpoint tremble, a telescopic extraterrestrial gaze with the potential to expose the philosophic conditions of the two-movie reality. Is what Wittgenstein is describing by way of the duck-rabbit picture object not, in this sense, a kind of not necessarily visual stereoscopy, a multidimensionality of apprehension, a relief which alone makes possible, for example, the experience of the meaning of a word? This would be to bring Wittgenstein's extraterrestrial description of what is seen into the orbit of Simondon's account of disparation, for which to bring about a coherence that incorporates the separate images of the left eye and the right eye, it is necessary that they become the foundation of a world perceived within an axiomatic in which disparation becomes precisely the index of a new dimension. As Bernard shows in Automatic Society, what Burns and Revoir call algorithmic governmentality is, above all, the automatic and computational liquidation of disparation, which means the dissolution of all those forms of what Wittgenstein calls custom and upbringing, or more precisely, the localized circuits and processes of transindividuation enabling disparation. That is, that make it possible to notice, as if from an infinitely far-away location, the stereoscopic depth and thickness of aspects, beyond this or that side, and where there can be no horizons of expectation without this index of a new dimension. The coherence of Simondon's stereoscopic disparation, of course, is a matter of how the left and right retinal images compose, whereas Wittgenstein intends to show, through the mutual exclusivity of the bistable percept, the impossibility of conjoining in a single moment of vision the two dimensions or aspects of the picture object's meaning. Yet this impossibility of overcoming the disunion of the duck and the rabbit does not mean that the two do not coexist at some point, even if this is an ideality occurring only at infinity, which is precisely neither interior nor exterior. Just as the conjunction of the image perceived by the left eye and the right eye should be, geometrically speaking, strictly impossible, and just as for Kant the sublime involves an experience of what exceeds the limits of the imagination. Surprehending the bistable percept as both duck and rabbit, retaining both aspects, is precisely a question of seeing extraterrestrially what is invisible, even if it is right there, like the figure in the carpet. As we saw, Wittgenstein somewhat vaguely describes the step beyond information in terms of the feeling with which we read a poem, and which gives it its ring. In addressing the question of the relationship of aspect blindness to meaning, he asks whether there can really be any kind of expert judgment through which the genuineness of expressions of feeling can be adjudicated, and he answers, again rather imprecisely, that correcter prognoses will generally issue from the judgments of those with better knowledge. But he immediately gives the kind of knowledge that this involves its properly Epimethean character. Can one learn this knowledge? Yes, some can. Not, however, by taking a course in it, but through experience. What Wittgenstein describes is precisely the singularity and infinity of the localized trans-individual inasmuch as it is irreducible to the algorithmic. This, he says, is no longer a matter of technique, but what he means by this demands careful reading. What one acquires here is not a technique. One learns correct judgments. There are also rules, but they do not form a system, and only experienced people can apply them right, unlike calculating rules. The question of aspect blindness is that of the elimination of knowledge as the index of a dimensionality that opens the horizons of expectation that, in turn, grant the possibility of a judgment, with rules but beyond facts, not without calculation but exceeding every calculation. At stake is the possibility of being surprised by noticing another meaning in one and the same object, without changing anything in the object, which in turn opens the possibility of changing the rules, even if it is for a game we can never master, and so of materializing a new world neganthropically. How does Wittgenstein express this possibility? For him, of course, it is a question of language games, of why, in the game of experiencing a word, we speak not only of meaning, but of meaning it. That is, of the difference such meaning makes. For Wittgenstein, this is a question of adoption, of taking over a meaning from one language game into another. He writes, "Call it a dream, it does not change anything. In this dream of learning and adopting a way of judging the genuineness of expressions of feeling, a dream that does not change anything, just as for Heidegger the extraordinariness of authentic existence is nothing other than a modified grasp of the ordinariness of everydayness, and almost nothing that nevertheless changes everything, we can locate the whole problem of repotentializing disparation, that is, of transforming the aspect blindness of our two-movie reality into a new cosmopolitics of relief by surrounding it with a fiction capable of fostering the will required for any possible, improbable, neganthropocenic revolution." Et voilà.